Hey, good morning, good morning. Give the Lord a hand this morning, for He is worthy of our praise. All right. Hey, I got some questions for you. I'm gonna ask a lot of questions. I don't know how much you guys love to answer questions and raise your hand. I mean, I always love that. So I'm gonna need lots and lots of participation this morning. How many of you grew up with a different worship style than River Run? Raise your hand. Oh, wow. Holy cow, that's a huge difference from the first service. How many of you grew up more of a liturgical style of worship where you had lots of ceremony, more pomp, circumstance, lots of ceremony, readings, liturgical readings, those kinds of things? All right. How many of you grew up where you stood up, you sat down, you stood up, you sat down? Would you stand up? Would you stand up? Okay, sit down. Good. How many of you grew up singing a cappella? There was no, you know what a cappella is? A cappella. You know, there's no instruments. Just one, two. We got another, three. Any more? Acapellas. All right. What about like big choirs? You had big choirs in your church. Anybody sing in the choir? Oh yeah, good. We hold auditions all the time here. How many of you grew up with, first of all, how many of you have only been to River Run? See, that's awesome. Last service, it was amazing how many people raised their hands on that. But you guys might know this, but how many of you grew up with hymn books then? All right. So for those few of you that's only been to River Run, hymn books are these books that had like 400 songs in them, and it had all the music written out. And we only knew about 20 of them in a church, and we would sing those same 20 over and over again, right? You guys know what I'm talking about. And for some reason, we always sang verse 1, 2, and 4. We never sang verse 3. Like, the person who wrote verse 3 always got slighted. We always just sang those 3 verses, unless it was Amazing Grace, which there's like 42 verses of Amazing Grace. And so we'd sing 1, 2, 4, 7, 8, 9, 13, you know. So those are hymn books. So you grew up with hymn books. How many of you grew up in a charismatic church? Charismatic church, come on. You guys are used to raising your hands. Come on, you can do it. All right, charismatic church. How many of you had dancing in your church? You had dancing in your church? How many of you had the tambourine lady? You had the tambourine lady? Oh, wow. Like, that's great. First service, none. We had no tambourine lady. How many of you were the tambourine lady? We had this one where it was like she had this white flowy dress. This was in a very Church of Christ in Lexington, Kentucky. She showed up one time, tambourine lady. She had this white flowing dress on. She was playing the tambourine. Our guys going, I don't think that's appropriate here, you know. So that was just kind of the church that I grew up in. Hey, how about banners? Did you have anybody do banners and ribbons where you kind of flowed those around, you marched those through the service like that? So I grew up in a church, and I grew up Church of Christ Christian Church area, and I grew up in a church where if you raised your hands, they would stop the service. They thought you might need to go to the bathroom or something, you know? Like that's how I grew up. No clapping. I mean, if you clap like this, you know, they'd look at you like, you know, you're the devil and kind of a thing. But I remember the first time that Michelle and I went to a really charismatic church. We were on vacation in South Carolina, and we saw this big billboards before the internet and websites and looking at all that stuff. So we saw this billboard. We said, let's just try this church out. Our kids were toddlers, and we put them in the nursery. And we go, and they sit us about where you're at, Ruth, like right about third row, right in the center, right there. The ushers set us right there. And then about 5 minutes before the service, a guy comes up on the stage, and he goes, hey, just want to let you know, if you're a guest with us today, we got some really things that we need to deal with in the service, and we want to give you time to leave. And true story. We want to give you time to leave, and you could go down the road. There's some great churches down here on the right. You can go down this way. There's great churches on the left. Just wanted to give you time. Some things we want to deal with. Michelle looks at me. She says, what do you want to do? I go, are you kidding me? I'm staying right here. I want to see what this is all about, you know. And it's a sad story. They came up, and the church handled it really, really well. They actually did a really good job handling this information. So one of their leaders, I think it was a senior pastor even, had gotten caught in an affair or something in the church. It was a really, really just terrible situation. But then afterwards, right after that happened, they came up and they were just like, but we're not going to let Satan ruin this day. No, we're not. And they were just shouting, and then they stood up and they started worshiping, and they were just going, like I'd never been a part of any service like that. Pretty soon they go back in the back and they get these banners, and they're walking these banners and ribbons and big flags around the thing, and then they start, whole church about our size right here, then they start marching around. They got in a line order like you would see at a wedding. You know, they were doing a line dance all the way around the auditorium. By the time it was like this line dance is going on, pretty much Michelle and I are sitting right there in the front. It's just the last two of us. We're just sitting there. And she's going, what do you want to do? I said, grab your purse and get in line. So she grabs her purse and we get in the line and we're just doing the line dance with them. We're just going down through the church. We get to the back doors and we peel off and we, yeah. Fortunately, that was a long time ago. I've been able to see God's people worship so many different ways around the planet, and it's been exciting. Out of all of those different worship experiences and the things that you've experienced, out of all of those styles of worship, which one do you think is right? All of them. Good job. All of them. And yet, at the same time, it could be none of them. Let me explain. You see, God is so much more interested in our heart than he is our method. God doesn't care if you use a pipe organ or sing liturgical songs or readings or poems or bang around on the drums, if you have fog machines or lights or you just meet under a tree. He just doesn't care about those things all that much. And so we're in this series called What Would Jesus Undo? A little twist on what would Jesus do, but a little twist on that. What would Jesus undo? I think one of the things that Jesus would undo is empty worship or hollow worship. One of the greatest worship experiences I've ever been to happened in this concrete floor building with cement walls and a tin roof, no AC, no fancy lights or screens, not even any musicians. I think there was one out-of-tune guitar with maybe only 5 strings on it. And we were in this room with fluorescent lighting, about 150 pastors, and I was meeting there in Central America up in the mountains of Costa Rica. And while I was there, we had this prayer experience that lasted about 3 or 4 hours. We actually just lost track of time. I think prior to that, I might have only spent 10, 15 minutes at a time praying. And we spent 3, 4 hours, just lost track of time with the Lord. And when the whole thing was done, when the last prayer had prayed, the whole place erupted into spontaneous worship. It was the most fantastic event that I've ever been a part of, and it just happened spontaneously when God's people had this amazing experience with God. And it was like the first time in my life that I saw heaven open up. It literally was like heaven opened up and I saw a window and a glimpse into heaven, and it was where heaven kissed earth. And it was like you could see a glimpse of what it's like in heaven to worship with the Creator. And I just started weeping. I literally just started crying. And you guys, you know, I'm not that way. I'm not a hyper-emotional person or low testosterone. I mean, I was just sitting there, you know, maybe I shouldn't have said that part, but, you know, I was just weeping. I was weeping for 2 reasons. One, I was weeping because of the majesty of God and seeing this spontaneous worship just erupt in the majesty of God, and I was worshiping and I was crying. The second reason I was crying is because I wanted to just bottle that up and bring it back so you guys could experience it, so you guys could see it. And I was just praying and praying that some way that kind of worship experience would happen and be manifest here among our body of believers at River Run. And then I thought anything I would ever try to do would just be a man-manufactured way of trying to manufacture that, like a worship leader that might have said, come on now, raise your voices, let's raise the roof as we sing verse 4, you know. And I thought the only way that I know for us to ever get there is for us to draw closer to Jesus than we ever have. As we draw closer to Jesus, as we draw closer to Jesus, our worship just comes out naturally as a response to who he is and what he's done in his majesty and for us. And going back to all these different forms, there's different forms that are right. Well, they're all right, but they can all be wrong. I think about this for you guys who are moms and dads. Those of you who are moms and dads. Let's just say, this is a hypothetical story. Your kids decide they're going to come up with a song about how great you are. Or they're going to come up with a poem. They're going to write a poem about you. You know, they're gonna sing songs about you. They're gonna sit you down in the living room. They're gonna come in. They're gonna say, "Oh, Dad, you're the best dad. There's no dad like you, Dad. The food you cook is great. You give us lots of cake. I like the way you play with us, and you don't make us ride the bus," or whatever, you know. They come up with all these little things. "Oh, Dad, you're the best, better than all the rest." You know, if you're a dad, your kids are singing to you, honestly, if they're telling you how great you are, it doesn't matter if they're singing quietly with their hands in their pocket and a little bit bashful, a little bit shy, or if they're singing to the top of their lungs and lifting their hands up to you. You don't care if they've written you a poem and that they're reading it. You don't care if they're reading what they wrote to you. You don't care if they're singing this thing out loud and banging pots and pans that they've gotten. You don't care about that. What you care about is their heart, that they're telling you how much that they love you. Mom's the same thing. Mom is the best, better than all the rest. She wipes away my tears and calms all my fears. You don't care. You don't care what they sound like. You don't care what they look like. You don't care what they're wearing. You're just happy. You're just happy that your kids are worshiping you. They're singing your praise. That's the same with God. Let's say on the other hand, though, as a parent, if your kids are singing your praise, that you're the best mom and dad in the world, and then they never spend any time with you, they're really rebellious. They don't try to honor you in any way. They don't think about you when they're gone. They don't tell their friends about you. You know, if you're a parent, you know the difference between somebody's just going through the motions. You know the difference between somebody's going through the motions and somebody's really living this thing out. That they think you're the greatest. You know the difference. I think the same is true with God. He knows the difference. He knows whether we're going through the motion, whether this is just some sort of a ceremonial ritual, or whether this is an outflow of our heart for how much we love Him for what He has done. God knows when we're going through the motions. He knows everything that you're doing. He knows everything about you. And even when we're singing to the top of our lungs and raising our hands, if we walk away from here and we don't think about Him, or we don't pray, or we're not studying His Word, we only think about Him the next time we're together and the worship leader is saying, "Let's sing this song." He knows. He knows if it's just a ritual. He knows if it's just a ceremony, or is it a lifestyle. He knows. He knows if it's a religious thing or if it's a heart thing. He knows. And Jesus talked about this. He talked about this specifically when He addresses the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 15. So if you have your Bibles with you, turn to Matthew 15. I'm going to go through this text. We'll start at verse 1. We'll go from verse 1 to verse 9. And Jesus is talking to the Pharisees. So while you're pulling that up, let me give you a little bit of background about this. Pharisees were the religious leaders of the day. We've talked about them a lot. They get a bad rap, right? I mean, Pharisees get a bad rap. They weren't all these just really bad guys. They were just people that were kind of caught up in religion versus a relationship and a heart issue. They were caught up in the law, wanting to do what was right, and the traditions of man. They were just caught up in all this. They were good people. They weren't just bad people. And the Pharisees get a bad rap. Jesus just kept addressing them, saying, "Guys, this is not about ceremony. It's not about law. It's about love. If you get the heart part right, you're going to get this thing right." And so Jesus is addressing the Pharisees, and they were always the ones who taught the religious law, but they also taught a lot of man-made, extra traditional things that they had come up with. They actually made it harder. I'll talk about that in a second. They actually made it harder for people to be God followers than not. And the Pharisees saw Jesus as a threat. So here was this man who wasn't preaching the law. And it's not that Jesus was against the law. That's not what Jesus was not against the law. He was for the law. It's just that he was for the heart and God's intent for everything. That's what Jesus was for. But the Pharisees felt threatened by him. because he was teaching some things that were a little bit different than their traditions. And they had heard word of Jesus had traveled all the way to Jerusalem from where his ministry is in Galilee area. Jesus had just, right before this in Matthew 14, Jesus had just fed 5,000 people with a couple loaves of bread and fish. You know, this is a miraculous thing. People had heard about Jesus. They were bringing people from all over the region. People were coming to Jesus with sick people so that he could heal them. So word was traveling, and it had traveled all the way to Jerusalem. And so the Pharisees heard about this, and they said, let's go see this guy. Let's figure out who this guy is. And so that's where we pick this up. Matthew 15, verse 1 says, some Pharisees and teachers of religious law now arrived from Jerusalem to see Jesus. They asked him, why do your disciples disobey our age-old tradition? For they ignore our tradition of ceremonial hand washing before they eat. Now, one of the things that I've learned is when you read the Bible as a whole unit, when you read the Bible as a whole unit of God's love, you see the grander picture of God's story for you and I. As opposed to what so many Christians do that can tend to be legalistic or dogmatic. They do proof texting, where they'll grab this verse over here to say what they want it to say, or they'll grab this verse over here to say what they want it to say. You can pretty much make the Bible say about whatever you want it to say when you proof text. You really can. You can pick this verse, you can pick this verse. But when you look at it as a whole, you begin to see God's entire love story to mankind. One of the things I've done, I've been working really hard at this since about November 1 or 2, is I've been reading through the Bible chronologically. I hadn't read through the entire Bible cover to cover for 20 years plus. And Pastor Tyler actually challenged me on this, and so I've never read it chronologically. You know, not every book was written in sequential order, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. It wasn't written that way. But they've taken a chronological look at the timeline and putting this chronological Bible into place. So I've been reading that since November. Every single day I'm diligent about it. I'm just reading. What I'm seeing, and one of the things that's just popped out to me is as we look at this story of God's love to mankind, what I see is that man has made this a whole lot harder for people to come to God than God did for himself. We've made it really hard by man-made traditions and legalistic and dogmatic and religious ceremonial type things. And sometimes the religious leaders would get obsessed with man-made laws, man-made traditions, and we do the same thing. We can sometimes lose sight of what God had initially intended. Like for a devout Jew, they believe that there were just two categories. There's just two kinds of people, you know. You've heard this. There's only two kinds of people, those who love Neil Diamond and those who don't, you know. I'm just kidding. The Jews say there's just two kinds of people, that everything falls in this category. You're either clean or you are unclean. And they became obsessed with this cleanliness. Some of you can get that. You're obsessed with cleanliness. I get it. It's not uncommon for me in the summer months to take 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 showers a day. I wash my hands on a Sunday about 20 times. I mean, I'm like a surgeon on a Sunday because I touch you guys, you know? Like, I don't know where your hands have been. I've been a little obsessed by that. We call that washing off the brethren. That's what we call it, you know? If you wouldn't think it was so weird, I'd wear gloves on a Sunday, you know? I said this first service, walking out, everybody fist bumped me today on the way out. But here's the thing, I'm not talking about that kind of obsession, or those of you who carry around Purell bottles, you know, and I'm not talking about that. We're talking about a declaration of being ceremonially declared clean as opposed to being unclean and unfit for worship. And so there were so many categories, everything. If there were animals, certain animals were clean, certain animals are unclean. The way you prepared your food could be clean or considered unclean ceremonially. Any kind of bodily discharge considered unclean. Pigs were unclean. If you had a skin problem, you would be classified as unclean. And the problem with being unclean was that it was sort of contagious. It was like cooties when you were in first grade. If you had cooties, you touch anything or touch anybody. If they touched it or touched you, then they were unclean too. They had the cooties as well, right? Anybody remember that? You guys know? Am I that old that you guys don't know cooties? Well, the same thing. So if you were clean and you touched somebody that had a skin problem, you would be declared unclean. If you touched a pig, you were unclean. If your spouse was unclean and you touched your spouse, bam, you're unclean, you know? You touched a dead body, you were unclean. And if you were unclean, you were not fit for worship until you had a ceremonial cleansing. And before you ate bread, you would do a ceremonial cleansing with your hands. The Jews still practice that today in a little bit different form from that. But what they would do is, I have a little Jewish hand washing cup here. It's got 2 handles on it. You can buy this on Amazon for $8. And this would be for Jewish families would use this today. If you grew up Jewish and I butcher this, I apologize. Everything you see is I learned it on YouTube, okay? But what they would do is, before you were going to have your bread, before you were going to have your meal, you would pick up with the right handle, with your right hand, and you would switch it over to your left hand. And then you would pour 3 times over your hand. 1, 2, 3. Then you would set it down. Then you would switch. You would pick it up with a clean handkerchief, and you would touch the right handle. Why do you do that now? Because this handle was unclean before, right? So now you take this. You make sure the water doesn't run back up your sleeve because then your arm's unclean. I just made that part up. And then so you pour it 3 times like that, and then you wash your hands, and then you would say a Jewish prayer, which I'm not going to attempt. I don't want to offend or butcher that at all. But that would be a ceremonial cleansing and a washing of the hands. And so what happened was they accused Jesus and they accused his disciples for disregarding their traditions. It wasn't about washing your hands before you eat to get the dirt off. It was about ceremonially washing your hands so that you would be fit for worship and fit to eat. And so they say, why aren't your disciples washing their hands like the tradition of the elders? And here's how Jesus responds. He says, but why do you by your traditions violate the direct commandments of God? In other words, what he was saying is, why are you trying to pick out the sawdust in the disciples' eyes while you've got this big log in yours? And he says, for instance, God says, honor your father and mother. Anyone who speaks disrespect, she didn't like that part of the message there. Honor your father and mother. Anyone who speaks disrespectfully of their father and mother must be put to death. But you say it's all right for people to say to their parents, sorry, I can't help you, for I have vowed to give God what I would have given to you. And what Jesus is saying is that you guys are missing the point here. You're so locked in on tradition, you're so locked in on the law over here that you're missing one of the very basic fundamentals of one of the most intimate, one of the most special relationships that could happen on earth is the relationship that you have with your father and with your mother. And he's saying, you know, the Bible talks about this all the way. When you're a child, honor your father, honor your mother. And even as you're older and your parents are older, honor your father and honor your mother. And he's saying to them, you guys are so worried about tradition and this commitment that you made over here that you're not even following the basic fundamentals of a relationship that I've laid out for you. He says, in this way, you say that they don't need to honor their parents, and so you cancel the word of God for the sake of your own tradition. In other words, you're more concerned with the ritual ceremony. You're more concerned with man-made traditions than you are for the very basics of what God has asked you to do in honoring your moms and dads. And he's saying, how can you, he's putting the ball right back in their court. He's saying, how can you disregard this important and sacred relationship? And he says, you guys are being hypocrites. This was just one illustration for the things that they were laying out to the people to make it harder to come to God than it really was. He goes on to say, you hypocrites, which we're going to talk about next week. He goes, you hypocrites. Isaiah, talking about Isaiah the prophet in the Old Testament, he said, Isaiah was right. He wrote this years and years before about you guys. He goes, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. For he wrote, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God. Let me ask you, church, how is your heart? How is your worship? The writers of Hebrews said, through Jesus, therefore, let us continually, all the time, everywhere, in all circumstances, continually offer to God our sacrifice of praise to Him. In other words, we worship Him when we feel Him, and we worship Him when we don't. We worship Him when we see the blessings all around us that flow down on our lives, and we worship Him when we're hurting. We choose, even when we don't feel anything, to worship Him with a sacrifice of praise. We choose to worship Him in spite of our circumstances. And our worship is based on His character, not our situation. Our worship is based on His character, not our likes or dislikes in worship. We will worship Him in the middle of our pain, in the middle of our heartache. You will worship Him with a sacrifice of praise. Some of you are doing that right now. I know some of what you're going through right now. Some of you, I know, you're battling this over here, but you're still worshiping. I know some of the circumstances and the hurt, the disappointment and the pain that you're going through, and yet you're still worshiping Him. Sometimes we worship Him with a sacrifice of praise, but every single day we lay down our lives as an act of worship. And worship isn't something that we just do. It's who we are because of who God is. It's what we were created for. And so we say, every day I worship You. I worship You in the way that I live in a job that I love. I worship You in the way that I live in a job that I don't love. I worship You when I'm healthy. I worship You when I'm battling cancer. I worship You when I have plenty. I worship You when I am in want. Everything I do, may it be glory to God, because worship isn't just the songs that I sing. Worship is the life that I live. Worship isn't just the music out of my mouth. Worship is born out of my soul in the way I live out every single day. Would you stand with me, church? Who will you worship? Who is our God? He is our rock. He is our redeemer. He is our righteousness. Our God is our deliverer, and He is our defense. He is our shield. He is our salvation, and He is our strength. Who is God? He is the bread of life. He is the living water. He is the good shepherd. He is the true vine. He is the way. He is the truth, and He is the life. Who is Jesus? He is the light of this world. He is the Lamb of God. He is the Lion of Judah. My God is all powerful. He is ever present. He is good through and through. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He's the beginning and the end. Jesus is the soon returning, conquering King of Kings. He is the Lord of Lords. Let's worship Him, church. Let's worship Him.